Welcome to the Triumphant Birth Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Reichschlager, and today we are joined by Hayley and her baby, Jonah. Yes. So today, Hayley is a mom of 3. You have Olivia, who is almost 4. Mm-hmm. You have Noah, right, who is 16 months.
Yep.
And then Jonah, who is almost a month old. So I am super grateful that you're here with a baby who is almost a month old. And Hayley, I'm told, has an amazing story. And when I do these interviews, I try not to get all the details ahead of time because I'm learning your story right along with everybody else. Yeah. But you are local here to me, and so I'm so happy to be sitting with you here in person. It's really a treat. Yeah. So today we'll be talking about your first and second births primarily.
Yes.
And is there anything else you would like to add about your background or anything important to know about you before we dive in?
I did just get my doula certification. So
oh, that's
so that's new and exciting. I did my first birth when I was 32 weeks pregnant with him.
We'll talk about that later. Okay, great. So how do we want to start? Okay, so Olivia's birth.
Yes.
So that is just for like high level bullet points. So that one was a bit traumatic for you, you said,
yes.
And then you had a redeeming birth with Noah. So why don't we start with Olivia's pregnancy and just how all of that went? How did getting pregnant go?
Sure.
All of that.
So my husband and I got married the week that COVID shut everything down. So March 21st, and then we found out we were pregnant in June. So we did not have very long of just being married, but it was during a pandemic, and we found out we were pregnant. We were trying. I guess we were not preventing, I guess. And so we were super excited, and she's the first grandchild on both sides. So you can imagine the excitement. And I was not prepared for how sick I would be during my pregnancy. And so that was really hard. Thankfully, I worked from home for a good bit of the first part of my pregnancy. So I was able to like stay in my pajamas and, if I needed to lay down and things like that. So that was helpful, but it was really hard. Like I never actually threw up, but I had that like hangover feeling without drinking for the first probably trimester and a half with her. So that was really tough. But then I finally, started to feel a little bit better. And I think I had a really hard time with that pregnancy because before I got pregnant with her, I was super active. I worked out and I ate really healthy. And when I got pregnant, I stopped working out because I just felt so awful. And I had so many food aversions that I couldn't eat the normal, like, healthy things that I typically ate. So I just didn't eat well. I gained a lot of weight. And by the end, I felt horrible. Because I'd gained so much weight, I just felt bloated and I didn't feel good. And so even though I was so excited, it was so hard. That was just physically a really hard pregnancy for me. And kind of going into the pregnancy, going into the birth, I knew that I wanted an unmedicated birth. So I had a midwife through the hospital, and it was not the care that I was expecting. In my mind going into it, I picked a midwife because I've always heard like the midwifery model of care is so different, and it is, but in a hospital, it's not the same as a birth center or a home birth midwife. And so my entire pregnancy, I sort of felt like they were like waiting for there to be a problem. And instead of just treating me like a person, I became this like we were waiting for there to be an issue. And I had some blood pressure issues before I got pregnant, like here and there, but they watched that so closely. And they would be like, okay, well, what's it going to be this time? And we might have to put you on medication and things like that. And it was just constantly waiting for something to go wrong, I felt like. And I sort of felt like, do they want me to be healthy? Like, that's kind of what it felt like. And my blood pressure did get a little high at the end, and they also kept telling me that she was going to be huge, which by the end of the pregnancy, I think I really thought she was going to be like 14 pounds. They'd scared me so much into thinking she was going to be massive. And so I had to do tons of like growth ultrasounds and things like that. So I think I ended up having like 9 or 10 ultrasounds when I was pregnant with her.
And when did those start? Did you have an early ultrasound with her? Or?
Well, at my very first ultrasound, they told me she was measuring big. So that was like at 10 weeks.
Okay, and how sure were you on the dating with
I was pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I was pretty sure I knew when I got pregnant. And so I just kept thinking like, also, especially in the beginning when they kept saying, oh, she's really big, I kept thinking, okay, but what are we going to do about that now? I mean, I'm so early. There's not really anything we can do about it until I get, further along in my pregnancy.
Except scare you.
Except scare me.
And alter your nervous system.
Yes.
To that.
And the hard thing was, it got to a point where I wasn't even excited to go to my appointments because I was so stressed, because I just thought, what are they going to say now? They're going to tell me that she's big. And I just knew, I was like, they're going to want to induce me because of her size. And I had failed my 1-hour glucose test. I ended up passing the 3-hour one, but in the meantime, waiting to take the 3-hour, I knew that was another strike against me, basically, because if I fail my glucose test and they're already saying that she's big, that they're going to want to induce me, and they may not even want me to have a vaginal birth. And so I ended up switching providers at 33 weeks.
Okay, so you were with a hospital midwife at that point. Who did you switch to?
I switched to an OB within the hospital system, mainly because I didn't feel like I was getting midwife care. So I thought at that point, I might as well just switch to an OB. And I didn't know the options as far as like home birth and birth centers. I hadn't been here for very long. I moved here in 2019 and this was in 2020. Mm-hmm. And so I just didn't know that there was a lot of options. And I didn't know a lot about birth at that point, except for that I wanted an unmedicated birth. And so I switched providers, and she was better. She didn't think that she was big. And so she was like, when she palpated my stomach for the first time, she said, I don't know where this big baby is that they keep talking about.
There's an OB that palpated your stomach?
She did.
That's incredible.
And I was shocked. Now, knowing what I know now, I'm surprised that she did that, because I know that that's not common. Yeah. But she felt my belly and she had like a weird look on her face. And I said, oh, what's wrong? And she said, I just don't know where this big baby is. She said, I mean, she's not tiny, but she said, I don't feel like she's huge.
How did you process that at that point? Because was it like,
I felt validated.
Oh, good, or was it like I could see a lot of different emotions.
I felt very validated because I think by that point I had kind of started to realize that there was like some scare tactics involved, and so at first I was scared, but as I went further into my pregnancy, and the more I started to educate myself, the more that I was like, is she that big? And again, they're going off ultrasounds, which we know, especially later in pregnancy, are not accurate. And so when she said that, I was like, okay, she's not going to be 14 pounds, And so that was validating for sure, but my blood pressure was still on it wasn't dangerously high, but it was on the high side.
Do you think that the high blood pressure was part of just going into the office, like the white coat syndrome?
100%. Okay. It was. And I deal with anxiety in general. And so again, knowing what I know now, looking back on the experience, I attribute a lot of that to just anxiety, because I always was scared what they were going to say to me. So after I switched providers at 33 weeks, then I went it was the week that I turned 37 weeks, and I had went for my appointment, and she had checked me for the first time, which I didn't ask for, but she said we needed to, which again, I just didn't know what I know now. Yeah. And
I just want to pause for a second, because I feel like, and I have been this way too, where like you don't, like everybody in the process of learning things, we almost feel like we have to sort of explain ourselves in the beginning, and we don't have to do, like, I completely get it. I do the same thing, and it's like, I tell clients a lot, we do the best that we can with the information that we have at the time. And then when we get new information and process that, then we can make different choices. And that's just what was happening for you in that first pregnancy, just like so many other moms.
And I think that's been part of my journey too, is I've had to that exact phrase. I did the best I could with the information that I had because I just didn't know. And so when she checked me and I was nothing.
Of course.
Zero.
Well, 37 weeks.
37 weeks, right.
Yeah, right.
And she did offer the 39-week induction. And I said, I'm not interested. I don't want to be induced. And that was one thing I knew that I didn't want because I knew the chances of, more interventions happen when you're induced. And so I told her that I was not interested in that. But she said, okay, you're not dilated, you're not effaced, which I knew that I was early still, so I wasn't, discouraged by that or anything. But that next day at work, I was in the process of learning a new position. And I was very anxious because the girl who I was going to be taking it over from, she was actually also pregnant and she was going to be going on maternity leave when I came back. So it was kind of this sort of rush to like learn this new information. And I was very anxious. And so another one of our coworkers came in and she said, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm okay." And she said, "You're really flushed." And she was like, "You don't look like you feel good." And I was like, "Oh, I don't know. I'm a little like which I'm always like I run hot anyways." And I said, "Yeah, I'm a little flushed," but I was like, "I'm okay." And she was like, "I think we should take your blood pressure." And I worked at a medical facility at the time.
Got it. Okay.
And so she had one of the nurses come and take my blood pressure, and it was high. Like, again, not just alarming, but on the high side. And so I was like, okay, well, I was like, I'm just going to go in my office and sit down for a little while, drink some water. And then they took it again, and it was still really high. And so the nurses said, I think you should call your doctor. And this kind of started the cascade of interventions. And so I called and left a message with the nurse, and they wanted me to come in. And at first I thought, okay, they're just going to want me to come in and monitor me. And they were like, "Oh no, we want you to be induced." And again, I did what I could with the information that I had. And because I was a first-time mom, even though in my gut, I knew that wasn't what I wanted and that probably wasn't what I needed, I was scared because I thought, okay, well, I don't want to do something that would put Olivia in danger. And so I went to the hospital, got induced, and so this was a Friday afternoon, and I didn't have her until Sunday.
Okay. And where is your husband at this point in the process?
He, I think he was just sort of like trying to hold it together because I was sobbing. Yeah. I mean, I was just, because again, I knew the induction was the last thing that I wanted. And so he was just trying to sort of like
support you as best as he could.
And he knew nothing he could say was going to make me feel better. But he just, he was like, "Well, we're here now." And he was great. He was trying to be super supportive and just be positive. But I told him that I didn't want to do Pitocin first. I wanted to do everything else before that. And so we did literally every intervention. And I stalled at a 5 for 12 hours. And I ended up giving into the Pitocin because I knew that with me being there for so long, I didn't want them to even start talking about a C-section. And so when they finally said, okay, Pitocin is really like the last thing, I think we should do that. And I did have a doula, and she kind of was, we were doing all the things, but it kind of got to the point where it was like,
yes,
we don't know what else to do.
Right. If you're committed to an induction, there can be that fine line of like, okay, how long, and our bodies are so intelligent. And also, if we're in the medical environment and we're committed to having a baby that day for whatever reason, whether it's medical or elective, it's sort of like, okay, we're also playing the game of how long do we want to wait, and then before we don't want exhaustion to happen and all of that.
Exactly. And so I gave in to the Pitocin. We started the Pitocin, and they were bumping it up so fast. And at that point, I was having contractions, but I was handling them. It was like, they were intense, and I was having to breathe through them, but it was very mild. And so as soon as we started the Pitocin, it was hard and fast, and it was like from 0 to 100, and I was not coping. And we were trying to do everything, and I remember at one point just laying in bed and just sort of like writhing around because it was so painful, because it had gone from being manageable to just complete 180. And so I I think I did that for a few hours, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. And so we went into the bathroom. With my, had my IV pole, and like I had to help my husband help me into the bathroom. And I just sat down on the toilet and I just started sobbing. And I was like, I can't do this. And at this point, I'm still at a 5. And he was like, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I think I need to get an epidural. Because, and again, looking back at this now, I know this is not how it works, but in my mind, I'm thinking, I can't do this for another 5 centimeters, because I'm thinking I've been here, and this was late Saturday night.
Yeah.
So it's almost early hours of Sunday morning.
That's a long time.
Yes. And in my mind, I'm like, am I going to be that many more hours to go another 5 centimeters?
Your brain does the extrapolation thing.
And I just thought, I can't do it. And my husband, bless his heart, he was so sweet. He said, I know that you really didn't want to get an epidural. And I said, but I think that I have to. And he was like, okay, then let's do it. So they gave me the epidural. I passed out.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And because, this is, early hours of Sunday morning, and I've not slept since Thursday night. Mm-hmm. And so he said I literally started snoring the second they gave me the epidural. And I slept for about 2 hours. And the next thing I know, they're busting into the room, turning on all the lights, running around, and I'm waking up from this like dead sleep, and I'm like, what is going on? And so they wake my husband up and my doula and me, and I'm asking all these questions, and no one's answering me. And I'm like, is she, because my first thought, of course, is something's wrong with my daughter, and I'm like, is she okay? And no one's answering me. And of course, it seemed like it was a very long time. It probably wasn't that long, but finally I just said, please, can someone tell me if she's okay? And they said, we can't get her heartbeat. And so, of course, then I'm panicking. And then they told me that my blood pressure had dropped really low. And I kind of started feeling like I was going to pass out. And I started getting that like tunnel. And so they put oxygen on me. And so I'm holding on to the oxygen and like taking breaths and taking off the oxygen and asking, can someone tell me what's going on? And of course, my husband's standing there helpless, and come to find out later, she had just moved down into my birth canal so quickly. They had me on the monitors, but where the monitors were, she wasn't there anymore. But at the time,
your nervous system doesn't know any different than the environment that it creates.
And there was like a sense of like panic almost in the room. So of course that scared me. And now looking back, I think like, why were they so panicked? So anyways, they're like, you're at a 10, you need to push. And of course, I'm like still kind of in this haze because I was sleeping so hard, for those 2 hours. And I'm just like, wait, what's going on? And so they're like telling me to get, of course, again, I have an epidural, and it was very, very heavy. I've heard people say that like, sometimes when it's light, they can feel like the pressure, but they don't feel pain. I couldn't feel anything at all.
So they didn't really have that buffer time to sometimes they will say, okay, we'll turn the epidural down so you don't feel anything. They didn't do that. No. And so they wanted me to get up and get onto my hands and knees. And I was like, how? Mm-hmm. I couldn't. And so they helped to flip me over, and they kind of put the bed up so I could kind of hold on to the back of the bed and was on my knees. But my arms were like shaking because I'm holding up my entire body weight because my legs are just completely numb. And so for a little while I did that, and I said, I can't, like my arms are so tired, I can't hold myself up. And so and of course, like that was another thing, I didn't want to have like coached pushing, but because I couldn't feel anything, of course,
I had to have them tell me what to do. And so they'd say, push like this. And I'm like, but I can't feel anything, so I don't know if that's how I'm pushing, And so it was about 2 hours of pushing, and she finally came out, and I tore at a 3rd degree tear. And there was like a sense of relief for sure when she came out, but it wasn't that euphoric, high that you hear people talk about when they have like an unmedicated birth. And so I was happy, of course, and I was, so happy that she was here, and I was so glad that I was done. But I just felt like I immediately felt robbed because I had this idea in my head of what I wanted my birth to be, and it was so far from that. I felt like all the things that I'd said I didn't want is exactly what happened, minus a C-section, And so and even going home, like, you know, I could barely walk because I had a 3rd-degree tear, and she had a ton of issues with like lip, tongue, cheek tie. She had a high palate, so breastfeeding was really hard, and we ended up getting a donor until she was 8 months old because my milk never came in, and so it was just a lot of like, you know, the postpartum was just like the pregnancy and the birth. It was all just not what I had expected and not what I wanted, and so it took me a while to even like get to a place. I knew I wanted to have more kids, but it took me a while to get to a place where I was like, I think I can be pregnant again, and I think I could do this again. So once I made that decision, then it was like, okay, how can I do everything in my power to have a completely different experience? And so we got pregnant with my son.
I just want to pause
Yeah.
for a second, because that, just to like, everybody take a deep breath. It's a lot to go through.
It is.
It's a lot to go through for both you and your baby.
Yeah.
And like, we're talking through this so quickly, and it's a podcast, and we don't want to be on this podcast for 6 hours.
Right.
You know, but it's I think worth pausing, because it's a lot to process and go through. And I know there are people listening who have either gone through something similar, or they might, you know, they're planning their own birth.
Yeah.
And so really understanding the gravity of the situation and what choices you make. I'm not saying that your choices result, you know,
Sure.
you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not that you caused your 3rd-degree tear or anything like that. But these things happen.
Yeah.
And so coming back from that, and, you know, it seems, as we're talking about it, that a jump from an experience like that to then, okay, I'm ready to have another baby. There's a lot in between that, whether that's postpartum mood disorders or, you know, all the physical healing. Did you do pelvic floor therapy or anything?
I did not until I had my son, my first son.
Got it. But you felt healed enough to where
Yeah.
you felt whole and safe enough to.
And I think I was able to really process what happened and look at the situation from a different perspective. That's that I was out of it, and I could look back and kind of see, like, again, not that any of it is my fault, but I could see the decisions that I made and how those affected the situation, and how I was sort of forced into making decisions that I didn't feel comfortable with, but I didn't know enough to advocate for myself.
So just as a side note, we're going to do an episode at some point on that's completely focused on informed consent, coercion, and the law. So I'm really looking forward to that one. But continue. Okay.
Yes.
So one question before we move forward into Noah's birth. So did you have any specific tools that helped you in that time frame before to then point to, okay, now I'm ready to try for another baby?
I completely immersed myself into like all things birth. I listened to podcasts. I listened to, anything that I could get my hands on, reading birth stories, listening to birth stories, evidence-based birth, following tons of accounts on Instagram about birth. And I was just, I became obsessed, which is of course now why I became a doula.
Yes. Yeah.
Because once you get into it, it's just becomes such a passion. And so I think especially birth stories, I feel like that, hearing about the people's different experiences, especially when it's kind of similar to my situation where they had this very traumatic birth and it was followed up by this redemptive experience, that gave me the confidence to know that I could have the same thing. And so once I started kind of getting into that world and kind of knew what I wanted the first time, but I didn't know enough about how to make that happen.
Yes.
And so when we got pregnant with my son, I was like, I am not going to a hospital. Absolutely not. And I told my husband, I said, I would rather give birth in our front yard than go to a hospital to have this baby. And he was like, oh, okay. And I'm like, I want to, obviously if there was like a medical reason, but as long as I'm healthy and the baby's healthy, I'm not going to have it at a hospital. And so then we found the birth center, Alva Birth Center. And I just remember the first time I called to make an appointment, I cannot, even just that first interaction. And I said, I told him, I said, I think I forget how far along I was when I made my appointment. And the lady on the phone, she like listened to me, and I said, I need to make an appointment. And she said, okay, well, first of all, congratulations.
Yes.
And even that was like so different.
Human connection.
Yes. And it was, like going into the doctor's office, it was just like, they just kind of like push you through, and, your appointments are so short. It's like, it took me more time to walk from the car than my appointment, And so she was just like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited for you, blah, blah. And I was like, wow, like that is how it's supposed to be, And I got a phone and I just cried because I was like, that's so nice, like I was so shocked. And just that sounds almost silly, but to go from a hospital or, like a doctor's office to that is so starkly different. And I just knew, I was like, okay, I was like, this is it, and my husband was a little bit nervous. Just because, if you're not, because we've been so conditioned to think like that you have to have a baby in a hospital and that it's a medical event, and so he was a little bit nervous. But once we went to our first appointment and we kind of talked through, he was able to ask questions and, talk through those things. And I think he was still a little bit nervous, going further into the pregnancy, but he knew how badly I wanted something different. And so he was super supportive.
Before you continue, I
Yeah.
just want to say that it's not silly to cry after you hang up from a phone call like that, because it is such a stark difference.
Yeah.
And one of the components of preventing trauma is to feel seen.
Yes.
And you immediately felt seen, and that is so important.
Yeah. And my first appointment with the midwife, I was just like, it just felt like I was talking to a friend, someone who like genuinely cared about me. And I was able to talk through my first birth and, talk about why I was making the decision to come to a birth center. And it was just I just felt so safe there. I just knew that like, this is where I was supposed to be. And it was so nice going into those appointments and not feeling anxious, not feeling like they were waiting for something to happen. And there were a couple of times where my blood pressure had gotten just like a little bit high. Again, not dangerous, but just like, okay, let's wait and take it again in a few minutes, And I started to get in my head about it probably around like 30 weeks. I started being like, oh my gosh, like, what am I going to do if it gets high? Are they going to have to risk me out? And my midwife said, I'm not worried about it, so you shouldn't be worried about it. And I was like, okay. And she was like, if there's something to worry about, we'll figure it out.
Talk about it.
But if until there's a problem, we're not going to worry about it. And that was just, again, like such a breath of fresh air to go from them waiting for something to happen to them being like, it's fine. If it gets there, we'll figure it out, And so I just felt so complete. It was just such a completely different experience, and I looked forward to my appointments. I looked forward to going in because I knew it wasn't going to be a stressful situation, and it was going to be fun to like hear my baby's heartbeat and, just all those things. And it was so different. And I couldn't stop talking about how wonderful it was my entire pregnancy. And so, and I actually had, when I think I was 29 weeks, I ended up being in a car accident when I was actually on my way to an appointment at the birth center. And I ended up having to go, I went ahead and went to the birth center, and they, listened to heart tones and everything sounded okay, but they were kind of like, we can't see what's going on inside. And so they went ahead and had me go to the hospital just to like get an ultrasound, make sure everything was okay. And even that was really traumatic because they very much made it known how they felt about me being at a birth center. And everyone was like, the doctor that I saw, the bedside manner was just like, she was so dismissive, and it was just, and everything turned out to be, my baby was fine. But I could not wait to get out of there, because especially after going from the birth center back to a hospital, you just like feel that stark contrast. And before I left from the birth center to go to the hospital, one of the midwives said, okay, she's like, just so you know, you're going back into a hospital setting, and that might be scary. that might be a little bit jarring. And even her just saying that, like, gave me time to sort of prepare for it. And just the fact that she knew me well enough and knew my story to, like, prepare me for that, and I'm like, so many doctors, they don't remember anything about your previous experiences, but the fact that she pointed that out so that I could prepare myself just felt, again, I just felt so seen, and so it was just, that was hard, but I was just like, oh gosh, I'm so glad I'm not having this baby in a hospital. But anyway, so yeah, I can get into the actual birth, because it was so fast, because I'm still shocked at how fast he came.
Okay. Before we get into that, how else did you talked about how the out-of-hospital midwifery was such a stark contrast to the hospital prenatal care. What else was different about it? Did you opt to still do the glucose tests and
I did not do the glucose test. And it's funny because when I had gone to the appointment before and they said, okay, next time is when you'll do the glucose test if you're interested in doing it, which again was like, oh my gosh, I have a say. I get to decide if I want to do it. And I said yes originally. And then they said, okay, drink. They gave me the fresh test. And they said, drink this before your next appointment. And that whole, month leading up to my next appointment, I was anxious every time I would think about it. And so I called a week before my appointment and I said, I know I'm supposed to do my test next time. And I said, but I don't think I'm going to do it. And I was prepared to justify my reasoning for that. And they were like, okay, great. And I was like, wait, what? I don't have to justify my reasoning and argue with, why I should or shouldn't do it. And they were like, okay. They were like, we'll see you next week. And I was like, oh, okay. And so, and it was just so nice to feel like I had that autonomy to decide that I didn't have to do that,
Did they at some point give you options as far as you can monitor at home? You could do these other things?
When I went to my next appointment and I told them that I didn't drink it, they said, okay. And they said, well, we kind of talked through what that looked like and that there were other options if I wanted to. And they did ask me why, but it wasn't like a scolding.
It's to be on the same page, to know you better as a person. Yeah. And
so it was just it was so nice to feel like we could have a conversation about it and I wasn't having to defend myself, and I also, got chiropractic care my entire pregnancy. I ate mostly animal-based this pregnancy, and I worked out my entire pregnancy this time. So just overall, I just felt so much better. I was worried when I got pregnant with my son because of how sick I was with my daughter. And I thought, if I'm going to be that sick and have a toddler to chase around, I don't know how I'm going to survive. And of course, I had the typical, morning sickness or all day sickness, but it wasn't anything like it was with my daughter. And that's originally why, before we found out we were having a boy, that's why I thought it was a boy. Because I was like, this is so different. It's got to be a boy. And so I was right. But yeah, so I went to my 41-week appointment. So I went past my due date. And of course I was like, oh, okay. I'd had such a good pregnancy, but of course at the end, you're just so ready to, and of course it felt so much longer because I had my daughter at 37 and 5.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So going even to 40 weeks felt so long compared to how long I was pregnant with Olivia. And so I went past my due date, went to my 41-week appointment, and I was to that day I was like, I'm over this. I'm so ready to be done. And
Were there any signs at that point at 41 weeks? No contraction?
None. I had some Braxton Hicks here and there, and I'd been on and off having them, but it was never consistent. There was never any kind of a pattern, and it was never painful. And so when I went in that day, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so over this. I was I was crabby, and I was like, I'm just ready to be done, and I'd reached that point. And so my midwife was like, okay, well, what, kind of just talked through that. And she was like, I can do a membrane sweep if you want. And she was like, well, what do you want to do? And I thought about saying yes. And then I was like, I've preached this whole time about how this pregnancy, I want to let everything happen the way that it's supposed to, let my body do its thing. And so I was like, okay, no, I'm not going to get a membrane sweep. and I don't even want you to check me.
That is some self-control when you're at that point.
It was very hard because and even like getting checked, because I was like, I don't want to get in my head about, because I could be 3 centimeters for 2 weeks or whatever. And so I was like, I don't even want to check because I don't want to know, because I don't want to get in my head about it. And she's like, okay. She's like, well, she's like, that was a Thursday. And she was like, well, let's just wait. And I'm like, okay. So I head home. I have a chiropractor appointment. And while I'm getting adjusted, Sadie is like,
shout out Dr. Sadie.
She adjusts me and she goes, whoa. And I was like, what? And she said, you're about to have this baby. And I was like, what? And she's like, I'm telling you. She was like, you feel different. She was like, you're like loose. Like everything is just like loosey-goosey. And I was like, okay. I just thought, whatever, we'll see. I was like, I'm hoping she's right, Right. And so this was like at 11 o'clock. I go home. I put my toddler down for a nap. I'm watching TV, sitting on the couch, and I start having like period cramps. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I don't even pay attention to it because I'm like, oh, this is probably nothing. Because I'd had Braxton Hicks here and there, and so I just kind of ignored it. And then they kind of got more intense throughout the day. Still not painful, just enough that I kind of had to pay attention to them. And as the day went on, they just got more intense. But I didn't tell my husband. I didn't say anything because I was like, I'm not going to get worked up about it. I'm just not, And so he comes home at like 5. And I did tell him, I was like, I don't know. I think like I might maybe be. And he was like, really? And I'm like, I don't know, because I've never gone into labor. So I don't know. Yeah, right. So I'm like, I've never done this on my own. So I really don't have anything to compare to. And so we ate dinner and put my toddler to bed. And by the time I put her to bed, it was starting to be like, again, not super painful, but they were more consistent, like, up and down, ebb and flow kind of a thing. And I was having to breathe through them. And so I put her to bed and got in the shower. And my mom had texted me. It's so funny looking back at my text messages and kind of like where my head was at. So my mom had texted me at like 9 because I had told her that I thought I might be in labor. And so she's like, how are you feeling? And I'm like, oh, I'm okay. I was like, I'm just going to go to bed. Because in my mind, I really thought like, okay, it'll probably be not till early in the morning. Like maybe we'll go to the birth center like first thing. And so I didn't even really like say bye to my daughter because I just thought that I would see her again in the morning. Sure. I thought, because my husband's parents were going to take her. And so I thought, I'll just see her before we'll drop her off at their house, And so I didn't even really, and that's one like thing I wish I would have like held her a little longer and like, but I just didn't think that it would happen so fast. And so I went to bed, and typically, especially when I'm that pregnant, I like lay down and I like pass out. But I laid down and I just couldn't get comfortable. I kept like tossing and turning. And then it got to the point where when I would have a contraction, I would like flip over onto my knees and kind of like brace myself through the contractions. And it's so funny looking back now because like, obviously,
of course,
I was very much in labor.
Second time labor denial is a
very
real
thing.
And
because again, I've never done this before,
Mm-hmm.
And so my husband came to bed, and I'm sure because I'd been in the bed for like 2 hours, so I'm sure he's expecting me to be asleep, and he comes in there and he's like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, they're like getting more intense. And he's like, okay. And he just kind of sits there like watching me for a few minutes, and he's like, do you think we should call the birth center? And I was like, no. I was like, this is gonna, because again, I only have Pitocin contractions to compare to. So I was like, it's gonna get so much worse than this. Like, I don't want to go too early, And he's like, okay. And he's like, why don't we just call and see what they say? So we call, and Katie was on call, and she listened to me have a contraction. She was like, hey, like, it sounds like you're like, getting there. And I had texted her earlier saying, I think I might be in labor. And so she's like, well, what do you think? And I'm like, I think it's going to be a while. I really think it's going to be a little bit, and she's like, okay. And she's like, well, just let me know. So we lay there for another like 30 minutes. And my husband's like, I really think we need to go. And I'm like, in my mind, I think I was starting to realize like, yes, this is real. But the thought of like having to get up, get dressed, get in the car, drive there was just so overwhelming that I which again doesn't
Further
make sense.
Confirmation
right?
that you are in that.
It doesn't make sense because I'm going to have to do that anyway, so I might as well go now. But I just like couldn't wrap my mind around the concept of that, and so he was like, and so finally he kind of was like, I like made the call. He was like, we need to go. So we called them, let them know we were coming. So I get out of bed and I go, and he grabs me some clothes to put on. And I said, I can't do that. And I had like a nightgown on, and I was like, I'm wearing this is what I'm wearing. And he was like, okay. So thankfully his parents got there, and we get in the car, and it was a rough, we're like 35 minutes from the birth center.
Right.
So it was a little intense. I think I had my eyes closed the entire time. And I was just like, so in my head, like, I mean, just completely focused on everything. Like I was not paying attention to anything that was going on around me. I was just completely focused on like the contractions and breathing through them. And we got to the birth center, and I feel like I didn't talk like the whole time we were there. I was just like in the zone. And we got there and got into the room, and I had a couple contractions they had like a chair beside the tub, and I had several contractions there, and I was having my husband do counter pressure, and finally the only thing I could manage to say was, I want to get in the tub. And so they're like, okay. So they start filling up the tub, and I get in, and I was in the tub, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes. And Katie goes, are you pushing? And I didn't even realize it.
Right. Your body just does
yes.
it.
And she was like, Hayley, are you pushing? And I don't even know if I answered her. And so she hurries and calls the birth photographer. And because she's like, oh my goodness, like this baby is about to be here. And of course, even then I still didn't think like, oh, he's going to be here really soon. And I remember she put the mirror in the water, and she says, oh, there's his head. And I didn't say it out loud, but I remember thinking, what? What? Like, you're kidding me. His head? Like, are you joking? And so all of a sudden, I was more aware once she said, like, are you pushing? I was like, oh, I am pushing. And my body just started bearing down. And I mean, it was so, again, to go from having to be told how to push to my body is just doing it. And it was such a wild feeling, because I've always heard people talk about this fetal ejection reflex, but like to actually experience it. And it's so hard to explain to someone who has never experienced it, because you think like, how could you possibly like not control the urge to push? But I'm like, the only way I know to explain it is like, you literally, like, it's almost like when you throw up and you can't stop yourself. Mm-hmm. It just comes out like that. That is how it feels. And so I think I pushed like 3 times, and he came flying out. Like there was no, like his head came out and then the rest of his body came out. He shot out, and I caught him and pulled him up. And my husband, thankfully Katie set up my phone and recorded it. And my husband was just like shocked. I mean, his eyes were like, he was like, oh my gosh, because we were like face to face. Like I was in the tub and he was outside of the tub, and we were looking at each other, and he was like, oh my gosh. So I caught him and pulled him up, and I immediately, and like watching the video back is like, it makes me cry every time, because I started sobbing, and I was like, I did it. And it was just, I mean, that euphoric feeling that you hear people talk about, like that's what came over me. And I just felt so strong and so powerful. And I was still like shocked that, because I think even though I wanted this so badly, there was a little bit of me that just was like, can I do this? And then I was just like, whoa, I did this. And so I forgot to say this, but we got to the birth center at 1 and he was born at 2. So it was super fast. So I was so shocked, and it was just the best feeling to know that like I'd worked so hard and like put all of these things in place to like surround myself with the team of people that believed in me and supported me and always made me feel like I had a say in my birth, which I'd never had that with my daughter, and we, unfortunately, things took a turn a little bit afterwards. We actually ended up going to the NICU because my cord snapped. But still, even that process was like not scary. because because of the way that they handled it. I mean, it was so like, but when they realized what had happened, he had lost quite a bit of blood. And so they got me out of the tub and onto the bed, and they were like assessing him, but they were assessing him on my chest. And looking back now, I just think like how different that would have been if I would have been in a hospital. Like they would have immediately taken him from me. It would have been way more panicked, I feel like. Whereas like the whole time that this was all happening, they were talking me through what was happening. They were telling me like they were, assessing him. And then they said, I think we need to transfer to the hospital. Are you okay with that? And even them just asking me felt so good because, again, like, of course I wasn't going to say no, but like the fact that they're like including me in this decision, So it just felt, again, it was like, I never felt scared. I never felt like, is my baby going to be okay? Like, I just knew that he was okay. And I knew that like we needed to transfer, but that was the right decision. Like I trusted them so much that I was never worried because I just felt like that I knew that everything was going to be okay. So we ended up transferring to the NICU. So my husband went in the ambulance with him. And then I of course had to like birth the placenta and all that. And then I went on to the hospital, but the hospital experience was not great, but just the process before that, it was just so calm. Everyone just handled it so well, the way that they talked to me, the way that they it was never like they were doing all these things and not answering me, which again, like that's how with my daughter, whenever they came in the room and we were running around and no one was talking to me, no one was answering me. It was just such a different experience, and it was unfortunate, of course, that we ended up going to the NICU, but he was only there for like 24 hours and didn't have to have a blood transfusion or anything, ended up just needing some fluids and rest. And that wasn't a great experience, but it was still like, when we came home, I still was like, felt so good. I think I felt so good, and that's what made it like not scary, that I wasn't worried about him because I just knew he was going to be okay. So when we came home, I think I felt so good physically that I like overdid it a little too much, because compared to my first birth, I was like, I felt horrible. So this time it was just like I was like sitting cross-legged, and like I remember I went to my first appointment and Katie was like, "How are you feeling?" And she was like, "Well, you're sitting with your legs crossed, so you must be feeling good."
Did you tear with him?
I did not. They said I had like a little laceration, I think is what they called it. And so they just did like one stitch. And the only reason she even did it is because we were going to be going to the hospital and I would be walking around. She's like, otherwise I wouldn't have even done it. But yeah, I just, and it was so nice to be able to like get up as soon as it happened, because I didn't have to wait for an epidural to wear off. I didn't have to, have help. Like I just was able to walk, and I was able to get in the shower, and it was just, I mean, it was like weeks before I could even like believe what had happened, So like from like my first real contraction to him being born was like 6 hours. And I just was shocked. I just couldn't believe it. And it was such again, you hear people talk about how powerful you feel like when you have a birth like that, but I still wasn't prepared for how powerful I felt. And then I was like, I'm a rock star. I mean, I just felt so good. And I just felt so proud of myself because I was so determined to have this different experience. And I had a completely different experience, and it was exactly what I wanted. And again, even though his like transfer, wasn't ideal, but I still it was the birth itself, like getting to like pull him up myself and, and just have that euphoric feeling, like it was all worth it.
Gosh. So if there's one takeaway or like one theme, there's so much in that, and you are such a powerful woman. And it takes a lot to hold all of that at once.
Yeah.
But to then go and seek out the practitioners who you feel safest with, and to have the capacity to like trust your intuition, your instincts is really important. But if there's one sort of theme throughout all of this, or one takeaway for our listeners, what piece of advice would you give them through your whole experience?
I think you have to educate yourself. That is the biggest, advice that I give people. You know, if you want a birth experience, you want this ideal birth experience or whatever that looks like for you, because that looks different for everybody. Not everyone maybe wants to give birth at a birth center or at home or whatever, but once you decide what you want, I think, you know, we talk about this often too, of people talking about, you know, we spend all this time like researching baby gear and like decorating the nursery and all those things, and those things are fun, you know, but you need to go into it. If you want a very specific experience, you have to educate yourself, because unfortunately our medical system is not set up to give you much power, you know, and it's very fear-based, because again, we've been taught that birth is a medical event. And of course there are times where intervention is needed, but if you are wanting an unmedicated birth, especially, you have to know what interventions do, what that looks like, and I think doing your research on, you know, getting a doula. I always say, like, people, if you want someone to advocate for you, you need a doula. And knowing, if I get this intervention, this could happen. And not to scare you, but just to know what that looks like, so you can make those decisions in an informed way. Because we are taught to fear birth, and which is crazy, because our bodies are designed for this. And so I think people going into it being empowered and knowing, like, my body is made to do this, and if this is the birth that I want, then I need to educate myself. And because I think for me, that was the biggest thing. I just knew so much more going into it the second time. I was able to make those decisions. And even if you want to give birth in a hospital, you can still have an unmedicated hospital birth, but you can't go into it winging it. You can't just say, like, we'll just figure it out and we'll just go with the flow, because if you go with the flow, then you're going to end up with interventions that's just
that you might not expect.
Yes.
Right.
And so if you go into it knowing what you want and knowing the steps you need to take to get there, then that's what's going to help you make those decisions and have the birth that you want. So.
Amazing. Hayley, the one thing that comes to me is just, like, in my birth class that I teach just here locally, or have in the past, one of the first things that I do is I ask people, okay, what do you think are the top two choices that determine birth outcomes? Yeah. And it is your team, so your practitioner who is around you, and your birth location. Yeah. And so if people listening, if they really can drop into their bodies, and, you know, if you're a faith-based person, if you pray about it, whatever that looks like, and really understand that you need to feel safe and full with those two choices, then moving forward, your choices from there are going to be typically more aligned.
Yes, absolutely.
So I just want to thank you so much. Do you have anything else to add?
I don't think so.
You're a doula now?
Yes, I am. I've done one birth, so I've one under my belt officially. But I decided I needed to wait till after this baby came, because that one was hard, doing it at 32 weeks pregnant. So.
And then I don't want to forget Jonah.
Yes.
Jonah was born just 3 and some change weeks ago, and just very, very briefly, how did that one go? It was awesome. It was pretty fast, almost as fast as Noah's was, and I got that golden hour and got to just lay in the bed and hold my baby, and it was perfect. The only difference was that I didn't have the fetal ejection reflex this time, which was so weird, and I kept waiting for it, but I had to make the decision this time to actually push, but he came out in 2 pushes. So it was great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so fun.
I'm sure that a lot of moms and moms-to-be are going to just love and value your story, and it's going to help a lot of people. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jamie.